Claudine Hemingway is a descendant of famed writer Ernest Hemingway. We bumped into each other at a party and decided to team up and dive deep into French history, but with a twist, by bringing a spotlight to those lesser known creatives in France. This is History with a Hemingway.
Welcome back to Paris History. Avec Hemingway. I'm back with Claudine, and we're continuing our story of the poison. So we know that a lot of people were getting poisoned in the 17th and 18th century. Claudine was telling us the history of that in part one, and today we continue with part two. So I'll let Claudine take it from here.
Yeah, so last week we talked about Mary Madeleine, and she was the one who they basically what she was doing and how she, killed her father and killed her brothers, and then she and her lover were, testing their poison out, killing people at the Hotel Dieu, at the hospital. But everything that she did is what launched the poison affair. So this week get into what the actual the affair of the poisons actually was. We have talked about this a little bit in the past, without going into huge detail when we talked about Madame de Montespan of Louis XIV, one of his great lovers, which we'll get into, but we'll give you a link for that one so you could go back and listen to that to get even juicier details on who she was. But we left off that now the Louis XIV appointed Gabriel Nicolas de la Riant, who was the lieutenant general of the police. He had him create a task force basically to look into everything about this because of what Mary Madeleine said as she was taken to the guillotine, saying, "There's so many more people involved in this. Why am I the victim? Why am I the only victim? If I was to talk." They should have gave her maybe a reprieve and said, "Okay, we'll chop your head off tomorrow. Tell us what you know today."
Yeah, get more.
But they did not do that. Yeah. But Rian first went after the alchemists that were in Paris, which then led him to a lot of the poisoners, and to the front door of a woman named Catherine de Chez Montvoisin. Catherine was born in 1640. She was married to Antoine Montvoisin, who was a Parisian jeweler. They had one daughter, Mary Marguerite, that would later turn against her mother, as some of them do. Catherine was first just a palm reader and a fortune teller, but she quickly, those things led to being a woman of potions and poisons, and she even performed abortions at the time, which of course was something that, this is 1640. So, which was at a time when, when we've talked about these in the past, and sometimes when you're watching these, when I was watching Versailles with a friend of mine recently, then you see, the king having sex with these, his mistresses. And it was like, wasn't everybody just getting pregnant all the time? There wasn't the pill, there wasn't birth control. They did have weird things that they did, to kind of hopefully counteract that. But abortions and very under the table back in a dark alley were kind of the abortions that were had at the time. But one of the most horrific acts of this time was a thing called the Black Mass. This was practiced around, had been practiced around, for quite a few centuries, but it was given this name in the 17th century. A woman who we've talked about, and I mentioned her last week, Catherine de Medici, was known to have held a Black Mass one time on May 28, 1574. But in the time of the poison affairs, it was a priest who was kind of kicked out of the Catholic Church named Etienne Goubert. He resurrected this practice in Paris with Catherine de Montvoisin in 1673. What this was is not for the faint of heart. And it's really kind of, when we talked about this in a previous episode, it was one of those things where you and I before it, I was like, I'm not sure how we talk about this without making it sound pretty horrific, because it involves killing a baby.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Which Catherine was never short of because of, her job also as as an abortionist. In 1658, Madame de Montespan was a lady in waiting to Henriette of England. She, the young Francoise, was now close to Louis XIV, who later died from suspicious causes. Montespan had her eyes on the king, but she needed to befriend a woman named Louis de la Valliere, who was his current headmistress. When Louis and the Queen, Louis XIV's wife, was pregnant at the same time by the king, She asked Montespan to dine with the king each evening to kind of, she thought maybe if I have my friend stay close to the king, then, it'll ward off any of the other women. But it was like basically turning the fox into the hen house.
Oh no.
So, which is also like, how did that go down? That it was like, oh, I'm pregnant and the queen's pregnant and we're both pregnant by the king. Like, and the queen, it wasn't like the queen could get outraged because you just had to deal with it and go along with it. And if you do watch the first season of that show, Versailles, you do see where this woman and the queen was pregnant at the same time. But it just seems so weird. And it's just like nowadays, like, I guess, in some places where they have multiple wives, that could happen.
Yeah.
But it's very strange. So Madame de Montespan got very close with the king. Louise left the court, and Montespan moved into her place. La Voisin is what Catherine Montbazon, she was known as La Voisin, which basically means the neighbor. She and Montespan first met in 1665 when she asked La Voisin to create a love potion for her to use on the king, so he would turn his attentions onto her. She ended up having 7 children with Louis XIV. So obviously something might have worked. If you watch the show Versailles, they don't even mention that they ever had any children. So if you watch that show, which is really great, just know that it's about 70% accurate. And watch it. And if you want to, then go look into who some of these characters are and what their real story was. But if you're watching it on, don't come back to me and say, wait, she didn't have any kids. That's not how it was in the show. But they just, this is how they do this. But so she ended up wanting to keep him around. So she would go to Montespan. Then when things started getting serious, because now she's having, she has 7 children with him. She has these pregnancies. And as sometimes happens, it's a little harder maybe to get rid of the baby weight. So she got a little bit rounder around the corners. And the king always had his eye on all these young members that were coming to court. And there was never any short of because, the mothers, it would be great if your daughter became a lover to the king, and he wants you to stay at court. He'll marry you off to somebody. He'll give you a title. He'll give you land. He'll give you all this money. So even as a mistress, you live like a queen as a mistress until he gets tired of you. Yeah. So, Madame de Montespan didn't want that to happen. So she returned back to Catherine. And this is when they started doing the back mass for Montespan. In 1672, Guibert and La Voisin came. They went to an empty chateau that sat between Orleans and Paris. And so Madame de Montespan went there. And as I said, it's not for the faint of heart, and I'll try to do this as delicately as possible, but they would lay her out on a stone slab, completely naked, with her arms out at her side, kind of in the shape of a cross. In each of her hands, she held a candle, and on her belly, they placed a silver chalice that would be there to, as I guess we'll just say, capture the blood from the baby.
Yikes. That's horrible.
So this whole thing happened. She had to chant something she basically said, "Esmonde, Prince of Love, I beg you to accept the sacrifice of this child. In exchange, I will keep the king's affection, the favor of the princess of the court, and the satisfaction of all desires," is what she had to say. They do actually depict this happening in that show Versailles. And I will find exactly the episode and put that on the website. So if you do actually want to sadistically watch what this happens, they did this ritual 3 times in 1673, at 1672, 1673, and the last time was 1679. Her sexual relationship ended with the king in 1678, but she remained at court because of her children. But it all came crashing down on March 17th, 1769. On a sunny afternoon, La Voisin was walking out of the church and was spotted by Renier, who quickly arrested her. She was quite adept at the dark arts, but she believed that she was was basically bestowed these powers on her by God. She'd go to church all the time. She was even a high priestess in the church, in the Catholic Church. But she believed that these things were given to her for a reason. And so when the lieutenant was there to arrest her, she just easily walked away because she didn't think she really had done anything wrong because her abilities were given to her, by God. Everybody knew who she was. She was so popular, just for even just going to get a palm reading or just to get some little potion for something, that people lined up outside her door every single morning before she even woke up. And she was quite wealthy.
Terrifying.
She made a lot of money. She was very, very wealthy for a woman at that time because of this. At that time, women had no rights, especially over their own bodies. And so be careful. There's some parallels to this.
Yeah.
Now, as women are losing more and more rights over their own body, hopefully a La Boisson doesn't pop up again and poisoning start happening. But she, she would help alleviate these pregnancies. For some people, some of these women were very high up. She lived on the Rue Beaujolais in the second, I'm sorry. And so she, after she was arrested, they came to inspect her house. Her daughter was there and basically authorized them to do whatever they wanted, to look everywhere. In her backyard, they found basically the corpse of over 2,500 babies.
What? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah. But I think a majority of those, were abortions. But because, there was, if she did these black masses, which was, everybody knew of this wasn't some, shrouded in secrecy what black masses were, or that they were being performed. So, and they could be performed to make potions for all sorts of things. It wasn't just for like a love potion, to get your lover. But this whole organization that was established under Louis XIV was called the Chambre Ardente. And they set up an office in the Arsenal that's down there over kind of between the Seine and the Place de la Bastille. They had an office there. They had 13 different magistrates, like judges, that were there interrogating prisoners. Experts, including doctors, were on hand to help delve into the chemistry and the poison in terms of the evidence to see exactly what was going on. The windows were covered with dark cloth because all of Paris was coming to get a glimpse of this. And, it was in the papers of the time. That this was going on. And so people would just stand there all day to watch, to bring, to see who were these men and women they were bringing in. Majority of these were women. In the years of the investigation, they ended up for 3 years, they had 442 people were accused, of which 319 were subpoenaed and 194 were arrested. 36 people were executed, and twice as many of that killed themselves.
Oh gosh. Wow.
So this was a major thing. And this is about 10 years before everything happened. The Salem witch trial in, the United States is probably the most famous thing. When you talk about witchcraft, everybody will think instantly of that. This was 10 years before that ever happened.
They already had their witch hunt.
Yeah, they already had it. So the few that were closely associated with La Boisson, because this had very far reaches, there was a woman named Françoise Philistret. She was arrested in 1680. She was confirmed to be involved with Etienne Guibert and the Black Masses as well. Francois was sentenced to death or life in prison, and she died in 1686. But her testimony would lead to the incrimination of Montespan. That's how basically it wasn't La Boisson who brought down Montespan. It was Francois. After Boisson's arrest, Montespan had contacted Philistret to supply her now with the poison she needed for court. Another woman named Françoise de Dreux was born of noble birth, and she married to a high-ranking member of the Parliament of Paris. However, she was in love with a gentleman named Armand Jean de Vigny de Puys, who was related to the Cardinal de Richelieu. She killed her husband so she could be with her lover. She was arrested and brought on trial for poisoning another man. He was also involved with the poisoning of this man's wife as well, because this woman was in love with Richelieu as well. She was later acquitted, but because of her, she'd bring another case back into light. Margaret de Joly was very skilled and as successful as Lavasson. She was arrested and subject to water torture, where she gave up the names of many of her clients, including Francois Desdreaux, who thought she was in the clear, but Drew was going to be arrested again. She managed to flee France, but she never was found, so she luckily got out in time. Marguerite Lefranc was the wife of another judge that she didn't like her husband very much. She, like Drew, killed her husband so she could marry her lover, Deprade. Deprade was only after her money. So when she found that out, that her lover wanted her money, she decided she needed to kill him, as one does.
Oh my, as one
And
does.
so, yeah, she was arrested and exiled. And so not everybody went to their death. Marie Boisse, La Brosse, as she was known, was the first poisoner arrested in the roundup. And she also pointed her finger at Lavasson. One night at a party, she had too much wine, and La Brosse was bragging to everybody how much money she was making due to the poison that she was creating for these women of Paris that wanted to kill their husbands and lovers. Someone at the party reported it back to the Lieutenant Rien, and Brosse was arrested, as well as her daughter and her sons. Marie Boisse met her fate on the Place de Grève on May 8, 1679, being killed. And her children were just sentenced to life in prison.
Oh.
Marguerite de Pollion obtained poison from Marie Boisse to kill her husband, Alexander de Pollion, but he survived and was able to hand her over to the police. Her beauty saved her for the same fate as many of these other women. When Regnier heard of her lenient sentence, he decided to exile her and sent her to work at a holding house for former prostitutes in Angers, where she ended up spending the rest of her life.
Wait, what? That's how it ended?
Yeah, so she, instead of having, she was the first sentenced to death, but they thought she's too beautiful to die, by being burned at the stake. So let's just send her to a holding house of former prostitutes where she'll spend the rest of her life. She was there to clean the bathrooms every day, which, was of course the whole. But she had to do all this stuff to help take care of these former prostitutes that were kind of locked away. In 1678, the investigation was going, and it started to point in the many directions to Louis XIV and the court of Versailles. Evidence mounted, and it was discovered that Louis XIV had been poisoned for 13 years by Madame de Montespan.
What?
And the Sun King ordered, if you remember when we did that podcast, they did some, tests on Louis XIV, and he had been slowly poisoned for 13 years. Obviously, it wasn't enough to do any damage to him, but he had been poisoned for 13 years. So when he found this out, he had told the lieutenant that he could only make notes on unattached paper. So he couldn't write things down in books. He had to make notes on unattached paper and destroy it. On July 13, 1709, 29 volumes of evidence were destroyed in a fire under the command of Louis XIV, because it basically pointed all of this stuff out about Montespan and how she had been poisoning him, and how she had been poisoning, and these other women involved in poisoning other women and people at court. And so, of course, he couldn't have that, because then that looks like he's weak and he can't control anything. So all of these things had to be destroyed in a fire. So a lot of the evidence against Montespan was destroyed, except for the notes of our good friend Madame de Sévigné. And some of the files of Regnier were still held to this day in the prefecture of Paris.
They still have some of that stuff. That's interesting.
Some of that, yeah. So some of this, though, we have all of this, writings of other people that said, and from many different sources, but the actual evidence of how attached it was to court and Louis XIV, that has pretty much all been destroyed. But there's enough of it coming from other sources that you could say, yes, this definitely did happen. But then he basically had them close this whole out. Like, as soon as he ordered this, because he was like, oh, well, we have to get to the bottom of this. But then once it started pointing a finger towards him, he basically was like, okay, stop. This is closed. destroying everything, pretending that like this didn't happen. In the end, 3 times of the arrests that were made, and again, 10 years before the Salem witch trial. So this was 3 times larger than what the largest thing that most people think has to do with poison and witches.
That's wild. And wow, I mean, there's just so much to this story. It could be just like its own podcast in itself. I mean, imagine getting poisoned for
Yeah.
15 years. Like, that's
Yeah. And
crazy.
it is crazy. And especially like you hear about all these things. And a lot of people have heard this about how, there'd be the tasters of the king, that they would have to taste his food before he would eat it. But I never understood that, because sometimes they'd be, you'd be poisoning, you could poison them, and it's not something that's going to kick in right away. So it's like, what, did these people eat the food and then wait 24 hours before it's served to the king? Because then anybody could go in and poison it again. It wasn't like the, taking a cyanide capsule, and, you see that in spy movies where they ingest it and instantly their mouth is foaming and they die. That's not, these poisons were created, to be undetectable and to not taste. So even if you were tasting their food, and even there's stories of that, Queen Elizabeth II, who died last year, had people that tested her food.
Oh, I didn't even know the queen had that. That's crazy. I mean, yeah, it doesn't really make any sense when you think about it. It's like, what was the point of that? Like, I guess it was
Yeah.
instant poisonings. They thought they were protecting him somehow. It wasn't a lot.
Yeah.
Obviously, it didn't work. He got poisoned for 13 years.
Yeah. And, back then, I mean, Mary Magdalene that we talked about last week, they were testing these out and doing actual research. Like, it was pretty methodical, the research they were doing, of being like, okay, we put 3 tablespoons of poison in this, this gâteau, and now we're going to take it and see how long it takes to affect them. And, but I'm sure that some of these things, like the whole thing about the Black Mass, who, like, just because you said these words and it's the blood of a baby, like, how is that supposed to actually, like, the belief they had in some of these things is pretty, it's pretty interesting, to say the least. I mean, now it's like, if you put rat poison, like, the fantastic cinema of the old movie 9 to 5 with Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin, and Dolly Parton, they accidentally poisoned the boss with rat poison in his coffee instead of, coffee mate. That definitely over time kills them. But, and it says on things like, do not drink bleach. Like, okay, that's a no brainer. Don't do that, because you'll probably die. But back then, what did they have? And I'm sure they had things that were killing people, and they didn't even know why they were killing people, because they just ate the wrong mushroom.
Yeah, they had a lot to learn back then, that's for sure. And how did anybody survive, really?
Exactly. I mean, and La Boisson, if you look up anything about the poison affairs, it's definitely La Boisson was a big, but there was people that came before her that were doing this. She just kind of became the poster child of it, because she was the huge, big arrest that was made. And then it just kind of started unfolding from there. But Catherine de La Boisson, which is funny because that means the neighbor. So I guess, she was, just any old neighbor living next door. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, it's amazing. Like you said, it's amazing anybody survived between, syphilis, tuberculosis, poison. It's amazing anybody survived it. And we have any descendants out of France.
Yeah, seriously. The food and water. I mean, so many things were going on. But thanks for tuning in, guys. And definitely check out Claudine's website, ClaudineHemingway.com, for more information. And make sure you tune in next week. We are continuing our adventures in true crime in France.
Thanks for listening today, guys. If you're interested in learning more about Claudine, her tours, history, and the beautiful photographs that she posts all over Instagram, tune into her website, ClaudineHemingway.com.